Hey guys, what's going on? And girls, I'm going to try to attempt to finish up period 7 with World War II right here. And probably I'll make for period 8 videos about the 1940s and Truman and 1950s and a part 2 of 60s and 70s. And period 9 is only 5% of your test at this time. I'll try to do some annotations. That's what I'm trying to do. Shift it over to my left over here. Maybe put a few notes up here, kind of rusty on the editing at this time. Hopefully this week, what I like for you to do is study as much as you can during the day, during the school time, especially if you're done with classes after Monday, and rest and kind of play and relax in the afternoons, like again, when you get home. So try to be as productive as possible studying for all your finals. Your math final, preparing for the AP during the day. Please do that like you're working. Go home, rest, relax, do something else here. Now, sum up FDR as far as domestically here, the New Deal programs went kind of fast here. You have to think about the significance of the New Deal programs. Now remember, please remember, progressive era, you get government involved. Does not stay somewhat permanent unless you think about the amendments that were passed. You do have more federal regulations coming in, like again with the inspection acts, more regulations about that. But then it doesn't really put these kind of permanent programs where government is involved and on such a national scale, national level, like the New Deal programs in this way. And also you think with World War One and after World War One, people go back to this individuality, go back to this government should not be helping out and creating dependency upon the American citizens. It's Hoover's philosophy, Coolidge and Harding's philosophy, that it's rugged individualism. It's making sure that the government is not so much involved to create some type of dependency. The severity of the Great Depression brought about FDR, brought about him throwing a lot of solutions to the problems that the government would have to get involved on a nationwide scale, and how programs stayed permanently. Think about this. There's New Deal programs still today, and really there's not a big debate about getting government out of people's lives in a total way. It's just how much are they going to be involved in kind of regulating industry, how much they're going to be involved about helping people out that may need some help, like again from retirement to unemployment insurance. What is the role of government at this time? But it stays in this way that kind of where FDR is transform the involvement of the national government into people's lives in this way. So you have to kind of, remember that. Change and continuity is really big here. How are the labor unions in the past 60 or years from the 1930s, when the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, down during the Gilded Age, up during the Progressive Era, down during the 1920s, back up in the 1930s with FDR, Wagner Act, Fair Labor Standards Act, things of that nature. You don't really have to know those acts in that way. And again, just thinking about the government expansion at this time has kind of changed. Now, what we're getting to really today is foreign policy. To kind of recap quickly in the Western Hemisphere, remember Roosevelt corollary. You might not remember dollar diplomacy under Taft, and I don't care really if you forgot about that, or more diplomacy on Wilson. You notice that our Latin American relations has been kind of very much intervening, being involved, occupying nations in the care of American interests. Under FDR, cause of the Great Depression, concentrate things at home. You have things established like the good neighbor policy in the Western Hemisphere. All right, but that's minor compared to what's going on over in Europe. As you know, what has not really changed since Washington. We know about the American imperialism moments from 1898 to the early 20th century and the early 1900s in that way. We understand it's a theory that, hey, we could afford to kind of look out beyond our boundaries, and we may need to because of Frederick Jackson Turner. But for the history of our country, whether we're involved in World War I over there in Europe, is isolationism, neutrality, and even you have a committee forming while the war is going over in Europe and in Asia, America First Committee. You even have investigations into why we were involved in World War I, called the Nye Committee. About big industry kind of involved. Remember, we do not join the League of Nations. There are some conferences that we're involved in, don't get me wrong. It does seem kind of a little bit contradictory, and somebody could argue that point. For the most part, though, that is the mood, the public mood of the majority of people in the country as the war gets started in 1939. So what do we have to remember about FDR and involvement in World War II? The date to kind of remember, of course, is December 7, 1941. But the 2 years or 3 or 4 years before, don't worry about the chronology of all these neutrality acts, cash and carry, but knowing that you could kind of write about as a growing involvement into getting U.S. involved in or preparing us for what FDR saw, that our inevitability of getting involved into this war. So you see him kind of saying, okay, you have a neutrality act, so we can't sell to belligerents, but what about if they have cash? You see how he's trying to push Congress to relent on these, again, as the war intensifies over in Europe, from 1940, surrender of France, invasion of Russia. He talks about Lend-Lease, again with, Great Britain. You don't have to remember all these types of things in what order to. He has he has the Fourth Freedom Speech here, in January of 1941. Again, don't worry about the dates about all this. As before that, predecessor that, he had this thing about dictators need to be quarantined, and again, asking Congress to keep on passing these so-called neutrality acts, but actually these neutrality acts are getting us more involved in support of the allies, the future allies at this time in here of Great Britain, France, and China, and even the Soviet Union at this time. So let's again increase on here. You have to remember that he goes to Churchill, signs the Atlantic Charter in August of 1941. He starts the first peacetime draft. Let's again in here, just in case he's saying that if war does come across the Atlantic or the Pacific at this time. So you have to understand that. But December 6th, the day before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, or even December 5th, you would say most people, or historians are saying probably 80 to 85%, maybe even higher, saying should America get involved in World War II? And about 80 to 85%, or maybe even higher, would say no, not at all. All right. So think about that. All right. It takes the attack at Pearl Harbor, Germany 3 days later declaring war on us, for us to get involved in World War II. Now, you don't really need to know about turning points that much in battles, Midway to, D-Day in 44. Let's go to what's happening, at home. And the big thing at home to remember is the patterns of war. World War I, you see that you had you don't have to remember the names, you had the War Industries Board. FDR has a War Production Board. Just know that the government is getting involved in price controls, price ceilings, and transitioning the factories, the automobile factories from like Henry Ford and the Chrysler Company, into like transitioning them to being for military preparedness, like saying, making airplanes, making ships. Really, what's going to win us the wars are factories, and our production is going to be pretty overwhelming against the Axis powers at this time. So, doing all of that. Now, what's the pattern too here is that you also have a kind of infringing on civil liberties. Like say in World War One, if your bonus court case, Schenck versus United States, you had an Espionage and Sedition Act. You had that with John Adams. You had an Alien and Sedition Act. You had this with Lincoln, locking people up if they printed stuff in the press. That was counter to what the Union goals were. So you see this pattern, and FDR continues this pattern of infringing on people's civil liberties, particularly against Japanese Americans in here. So first and second generation in here, and relocating them to Executive Order 9066. And that starts immediately around January, kind of the processing, relocation, particularly on the West Coast at this time. And the court case, one of those deal breaker court cases that you have to remember, is Korematsu versus the United States. Know that Korematsu and his lawyers are using the 14th Amendment. He should have equal protection of law. He is a citizen. He should not be, relocated, into these camps or displaced at this time. And the Supreme Court decides against him, saying it's a justifiable wartime measure at this time. Probably something that would be pretty egregious decision if you have any type of situation like that in 2023. So, a case that goes against him, and FDR continues this, program because he's, worried about spies, and that he doesn't find any until again, all the way up to the end. And a lot of Japanese young men, and some young women too, actually, served in the military at this time. Even though their families were relocated in a lot of these camps. So Korematsu versus United States, knowing that in here. So, and then you really get also the beginning. I know this is kind of touch base, but everybody thinks in the 40s, House Un-American Activities Committees begin to form because they start beginning to look at, maybe some subversiveness that's going on here. The Soviets are an ally, but you never know about the radicals at home at this time, or the radicals and spies that may be in government as well. Now, also the patterns of history from the American Revolutionary War all the way up until this war. Remember, things that kind of stay the same, the continuity. Your A-push test people are going to be always looking that you're kind of expressing this continuity. You're trying to express this change over time. What stayed the same? What changed? Causes of World War II, results of World War II, World War II to World War I. If you're studying things in isolation, you're not going to get ahead, in this test if you're just studying facts alone. So to get back to my point about the, another pattern here, women and African Americans make incremental gains in this way here. And we know about the symbolic kind of mascot of the women with the Rose of the Riveter going into the industry, but also serving in the military. And there's a lot of these auxiliary kind of forces here, WACs, waves in here. They don't serve in combat, but a lot of them are near in Europe and Asia. Near combat, they feel the effects of again, sometimes they're so near of bombing and shelling as well. And again, a lot of service, putting their lives on the line, and again in here and doing this, and also just kind of being prepared as being that second or third wave of force as backup in case it's needed to be about in the wartime here. So FDR is very confident that we were going to win, but the Axis powers, like this, particularly Germany and Japan, were very formidable, as we know, like again, so on here. So we did not know that. So really think about the women and how most women will not go back home as we might think is this way. Maybe middle class and upper middle class women will do that, but there's a lot of women who stay in the workforce afterwards. And again, it's kind of changing people's minds and attitudes about women in the workforce, women doing the engineering work, women doing welding, women doing factory work, even just doing, assembly line work too as well, was very much monumental at this time. You see that like with Latin American, immigrants that came over, particularly from Mexico, depression. We want them deported. We want them restricted. Now we want them to come back and help us, again, in the factories, and particularly in the Southwest on the farms as well. And plus, all of these, Latin American men and Mexican American men and African American men and Native Americans are serving in the military, serving in combat, again as well. Now, for African Americans, a bonus African American guy. I told you it was just wonderful that a couple of kids knew Marcus Garvey in here. If you can remember A. Philip Randolph too as well. I would not study him. I would not try to be concentrating on him at all. It's more about knowing that him and all the black newspapers and black leaders at the time, from the NAACP to the Congress of Racial Equality, they were promoting this thing called the Double V campaign. That's more important than knowing really A. Philip Randolph, knowing that victory abroad, victory at home. Victory over there, victory back here. Defeat fascism over there in Europe, defeat Jim Crow here at home. All right. So, and it was it really is the catalyst for the modern civil rights movement in this way. You cannot understate World War II and, African Americans serving and returning here, being this big push. And also a lot of, white soldiers too, and as well as kind of changing attitudes and everything like that, come back to we're fighting this ultra racist white supremacists abroad, and we come back home and we're supporting some white supremacy in a large part of our country, for the most part, as with laws. Seems very hypocritical, of us, again, in this way. So, and the sacrifice, of over 250,000 Americans to do this, and now you come back home, it really, really changes some, attitudes, again, for the modern civil rights movement at this time. So for a lot of people in the cross section, you have to know that. So Double V campaign, even I tell you, Philip Randolph threatened FDR, if you don't have these military contracts to be fair and equitable to African American businesses, African American contractors, or even African Americans working, that get these kind of jobs because of war production, that they should be paid, just the same as much as white Americans in this way. Or I'm going to try to, lead a major protest, and FDR kind of back down here. So can't forget that it's mostly the domestic side that you would like to remember, and mostly know the change from neutrality to getting involved into the war here, and how it's going to change us forever. Like the New Deal will change the role of government, the World War II will change our role in the international world. And what are we going to, how we're going to, again, be involved in other nations, and, we will be part of a new world organization called the United Nations. So let's get to the end of the war. I'm telling you, you don't have to worry about battles in certain way, again here, and details about that. And you don't really have to worry about specific conferences. We concentrated on that because we had some time in here, but really what you don't have to worry about Casablanca and Tehran. Really have to know about 1945 coming towards the end of the war, if anything here. And some of you are going to get confused about, well, what did they do at Yalta? What did they do at Potsdam? Well, You can even get these kind of two confused in a lot of ways here, understandably so. But let's just look at Yalta, like real quick, February 1945, the Big Three, knowing this is, just really a couple of months before FDR passes away here, that he's there with Stalin and Churchill, and then the main big things dividing Germany up into these kind of four zones in this way between the British, French, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain at this time. And I told you, I always said that, Stalin also made kind of a promise there's going to be some, free elections at this time, and maybe kind of a work onto like a world organization, at the time. I don't know if they've decided what the name was going to be, but to try to like a new go at the League of Nations at this time, they're all kind of in agreement, and kind of open up the front to in Asia as well. Now now you go into the summer of 1945, and you have Truman there. Then you had this British guy, new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who takes over at the conference at this time, and Stalin. You may forget about the Attlee-Churchill thing, that's fine. But notice that Truman takes over, again, the last big conference at this time. And this one right here is where, Stalin is making promises, again, to open up, to start the invasion from the north into Japan, to put the Nazis on trial too as well, to kind of for all this genocide and this murder. And also they were planning to do that with the Japanese leaders as well. Big thing is the kind of the backroom chatter of Truman alluding to that America's going to try to bring this war to an end with their secret weapon, or they got a weapon that they've been working on, as we know, the atomic bomb at this time. And Stalin, and I laugh a little bit because we said that Stalin probably knew, ahead of time. Then Truman knew after FDR's death in this way about this atomic bomb, and they've been working on it in this way. Here's the thing is that that's what if you get those two kind of crisscross, and he's already reneging on maybe free elections in Poland and Eastern Europe. That's all you really need to know, and you don't have to, worry about that as much. Again, about the details and getting from that time about the end of the war, which conference. There's not going to be an essay question or anything like that on there, but on here. But just know how it relates to the end of the war, what was happening. Now, let's not forget about the dropping of the atomic bomb. I think it's one of those things like the Declaration of Independence. You study it, you kind of start assuming that students know about it, but know the pro and cons of dropping the bombs on here, about Truman's decision in here. You get the August 6th and the August 9th, once again, Hiroshima and Nagasaki on here. So please don't, again, understand what those debates are to bring the war to an end. Now, coming towards the end of here is that is always the results, the effects. And this is where we kind of transition to kind of into my next video. I said, hopefully I'll finish up here, and will be about the 1940s and 1950s. But the effects is just, you don't say a lot of people were killed. Please don't do that. I beg of you, don't do that. Use a number. Numbers always been raised about the estimates. You cannot go wrong with over 50 million dead worldwide. And the Soviets, actually suffering the most casualties like that. So behind that was China, and then Germany. But you don't have to know really the ranking of that, but just such destruction at this time. So Germany is divided. Japan is occupied. Germany is occupied by multilateral forces too. You get a United Nations. Nazis and the Japanese are put on trial for the phrase crimes against humanity, kind of like the genocide that took place and the kind of war crimes, committed by both countries and regimes during World War II. I told you the United Nations is formed, but probably the big thing is that everybody's kind of been simmering ever since this uneasy alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, that tensions are brewing because there's ideological differences, objectives that are different from each country. And what emerges, though, is that the Soviets are a military power and the U.S. is a military power too as well. The Soviets are going to lose out on the economic kind of like growth that the U.S. will experience, but you see the kind of ingredients for a Cold War heating up between the two superpowers that will emerge. Britain and France are kind of the old superpowers. They are somewhat on, again, out as far as like, the two big players that's again in the world at this time. So that is the end of like period 7 in this way, but it's more about knowing about Progressive Era, World War I, 1920s, Great Depression, and World War II. You gotta know FDR. I said certain presidents that you skip, learn your FDR for sure, like again, in his presidency, if his significance and what he changed about America and his impact as well. All right, I'll see if I'll put up a few notes and see what I can do and get back my editing and try to work on the next 2 videos as possible as I can. So, all right, cool.